Okay, what led me to come to Westminster? I actually went back a number of years, actually 3 years, when I left the ministry in New York, and I was heading to Florida, to a home I owned in Florida. But I had it rented out, so we decided to stay in Baltimore, where my mother-in-law lived. It's in '68, April, actually on the 18th. I left Tampa, Florida that morning in a flight to Baltimore. I was met in Baltimore by Burnell Utz, one of the members of the church, and I was taken to his house on Sullivan Road. And I met for the first time those who had gathered together for the church, which was numbered about 15. The next service that we had was at the State Theater, and that was on Sunday. And we had about 30 in attendance. So after about 3 months of having the service there, they told us we had to get out. And so we left, and the following Sunday, or actually it happened on about Thursday, Brother Rich and I were driving by the theater, and we looked up on the marquee of the theater, and the group that was replacing us was a band of some kind. It was, and the name of it was Ichabod. And as we saw that on that marquee, we couldn't believe that any band would call themselves the Ichabod, because that word simply means God has left, departed, gone. Amazing thing is, the next day we was in Brother Rich's basement, where we constantly held our services, especially the midweek. We heard the fire engines, and as we didn't really realize what was going on until after we had our services and we went into town, and believe it or not, the theater burned down. It literally burned to the ground. Today it's a parking lot. From that point, we finally found a place that we could worship in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We spent about 3 months there. And our singing and our praises kind of disturbed the neighbors, so that the Adventists came to us and told us that we had to leave. So it was back to Burnell Witz's basement. Then we went we finally got a place at the Knights of Columbus Hall. From that point, I need to get back to where the fact that we were starting to look for land. And every time I looked for a piece of ground, a man by the name of Wishard, which was the county zoning inspector, had told me when I first came here and went to him that there was no room in Westminster for another church. So that every piece of ground that I went to the county about, he found a reason why we couldn't go there. Either a highway was going to go through, or a public project. And so I started praying and had the men pray that we could find something better. So one night, Brother Rich came to me and says, "Paul, we need to go see this gentleman at the corner of Lucaball Mill and 27. It was actually a goat farm. And we went to the gentleman and we asked about purchasing a piece of his ground, and he said absolutely not. He wasn't in the mood to sell. 2 weeks later, I was driving by that piece of ground with a realtor, and as we drove by it, he says, "Pastor," he said, "I just got word last night that this piece of ground is for sale." And I said, "Well, why do we go any further?" I says, "Why don't we just make an offer to the gentleman?" So for $3,300 an acre, we got to buy a prime piece of ground, 1.8 miles from the center of Westminster. That's God's doing. We needed to get an architect according to the county, and a builder. They have to be licensed in the county. So I went to one architect. He wanted $38,000. Understand, we had about $300 in our account. So So I went to a builder wanted a little over $25,000. So now let me show you how God works. I was kind of down in the spirit on Monday morning. I went to Mary's restaurant, a little restaurant in Westminster, and I walked in and I sat at the counter on the first seat, and I ordered a donut and a cup of coffee. Suddenly a gentleman sat beside me, and he turned to me and he says, "Good morning." And I said, "Well, good morning." Finally, I found out that this was Mr. Feeser. He was a representative of a prefab, I think it was called Northern Homes. Mm-hmm. And we sat there and talked, and he found out that I was a minister and I was here to build a church. And he said, "Well, maybe I can help you." And I said, "Well, how would that be?" He said, "Well, we could build the components to your church." I said, "Well, I got the prints. I've drew the prints to what I wanted." And he said, "Well, good, give them to me." And I said, "Well, what's this going to cost me?" He says, "Nothing." So God cut out $38,000. Then I realized we needed some money, and we didn't have no money. So I went back to Mary's restaurant again. I sat in the same seat, and would you believe it, a gentleman sat beside me and said, "Good morning" to me. And I said, "Well, good morning, glad to meet you," and so on. He said to me, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a minister." And I said, "I have a piece of ground here, Luca Ball Mill Road and 27. And he said, "Isn't that great?" He says, "My name is Sullivan." And he said, "I'm getting ready to build Sullivan Heights." And he said, I'm going to the bank to borrow $3 million. He said, "Would you like to go with me?" And I said, "I'd love to do that." We were able to borrow enough money. I think it was $20,000. And so we went ahead and put the church up, and the bankers came right before the loan was to give and said, "What equity did we have?" The company wouldn't build the components on the basis of the church because it involved too many people. So he said the only way it could happen was if I would personally accept a loan for $11,300. Okay. So Harriet and I signed a contract with Northern Homes. At that point, we had a building being built or being made in a factory, so I needed the foundation. So I went to a local lumber company, Schaefer Lumber Company, and I presented a proposal to them that I'd like to borrow $10,000 for 1 year. They told me initially they wouldn't accept that, but they took it before the board or whatever, and they did accept that. So that gave me the ability to put the foundation in the ground. We had two men, Brother Unger and Brother Rohrbach. One was an electrician, one was a plumber. From August the 1st to September the 1st, in 1 month, we erected that entire building by the men of the church. We didn't pay 1 cent labor to anybody. And I said, "Well, we have a building." And he says, "You have a what?" I said, "We have a building." I said, "Our men have built the building." I said, "It's not finished." So the bankers came over, they looked at that, drove away and said, "Everything's fine." So we had a building, and we was getting ready to go further into it. A gentleman came to us and said to us, "We have some furniture. Would you be interested in it?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely." We got 12, 14-foot pews that we got. We got 3 pews for the choir loft. We got 2 pastor pews, and we got the lectern. All of this was in prime. It had smoke on it, but no fire damage whatsoever. So for $2,000, we got all the furniture for the church. So literally, God wanted this church more than I did. and anybody else did. This is a miracle church. This is a church built upon events that God came and showed himself. Every one of these events, the purchase of the land, we had no money. We didn't have no money. We had no assets whatsoever. And just the fact that God provided the land, God provided the builders, God provided everything. In fact, the builder was Mr. Feeser. When we went to the building department to get the permit, they asked who the builder was, and I hadn't had a builder. And the builder's wanted $25,000 or more. And Mr. Feeser bent over and says, "I'll take it." So he became our builder, didn't charge us 1 red cent. Mr. Wishart said, there's no need of any more churches. He met me, well after the church was built, he met me one day in the hallway of the building department. And he said to me, he said, "Well, it looks like you won." And I says, "No," I said, "You don't understand." I says, I didn't do anything. God won. God had a purpose. God had a reason. And everything God did in the building of this church was a miracle. Yes. And I believe that every subsequent minister that has come to this church had his purpose and reason, and God used them in a special way.